20 months into the pandemic, more and more employers are making burnout and mental health more of a priority. Last year, mental health went from a nice thing to have to a perk to a true business imperative. My colleague, The Hill's editor-in-chief, Bob Cusack, had a chance to speak with Karan Singh, co-founder and chief operating officer of Ginger, a digital mental health provider. Take it away, Bob.
Karan, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
Okay, we're still obviously in the pandemic. It looks like we're going to be hitting year 2 in a few months. How has the pandemic affected mental health, and specifically for you at Ginger as well?
You know, Bob, I think in many ways it's been this great awakening, sort of a reckoning in the workplace, if you will, almost that productivity. The sort of fundamental notions of productivity have really been challenged, that productivity had to happen within the 4 walls of an office. And it turns out actually you can be quite effective at home and on the road. And I think it's also highlighted that life is messy, right? That there aren't these bright lines between work and home, and that we're all going through something, right? And challenges with the spouse, childcare, sick parent, trouble sleeping. So I think in many ways the pandemic has really shown a strong light on mental health and mental wellness and some of the challenges that most everyone is going through. But it's also created a great opportunity to encourage many more people to be forthright about what they're going through and to start to seek access to care. And so we've certainly seen that at Ginger and at Headspace Health more broadly, the incredible need that employees across the country have now for mental health.
How has corporate America accepted this? You mentioned a little bit about, life is complicated. And I remember when the pandemic started, there were a lot of articles about, well, wait a minute, we're going to have to make sure our employees work. And what has happened by and large is that employees are working and sometimes they're working too much. And that's a mental health strain. So how has the pandemic in corporate America realized, hey, mental health is an important issue and we've got to address it head on?
Well, I'd say it's not uniform, but there has been a material recognition. I think the idea that mental health has moved from the back room to the boardroom, if you will, that not just heads of HR, heads of people, but it is the responsibility of a CEO to create an environment that encourages mental strength and mental wellness, not just mental sickness, right? And I think it starts with at least an acceptance and a recognition and conversation that's happening at the leadership levels that mental health matters. And then it moves into starting to create access to solutions that are accessible, that are easy to embrace, no matter the time of day or the day of night, to really get help when you need it. And so I think we're starting to see a lot of employers be much more proactive in upgrading the offerings that they've made available to their employees, and not just offering them, but actually starting to advocate that they be used.
Mm-hmm. As far as what your company's been around, if I'm not mistaken, a decade, 10 years. What have you learned in those 10 years and any surprises along the way that really you just didn't know before you started the company?
Decade is a long time, Bob. The world has changed quite a bit, and it's certainly changed quite a bit in the last 20 months, I'd say. So in some ways, there's the pre-COVID answer, the pre-pandemic answer, if you will, and then there's sort of what has happened during the pandemic. I'd say the mental health has been a challenge for so many people. Close to 1 billion people around the world have mental health challenges today, and that has certainly continued to accelerate through the pandemic. I think what has changed and what I think has been a silver lining, if you will, is again, a recognition that it doesn't have to be a stigmatized issue that you can't be open about, that it is something that actually you can address. And then if you do address it and you support it, it can have an incredible impact on you or your team's productivity and ability to deliver on whatever you set out for. So I'd say one of the biggest learnings that we've seen is that mental health impacts really so many different kinds of people and different jobs and different environments. There are these same consistent stressors that you can actually start to create resources that help them in those scenarios and actually help them get much better.
What are some of the biggest frustrations you have? I mean, I've known people with mental health, and sometimes people who don't understand it, they don't realize it's a disease,
Yeah.
that there's a notion, and I do think it's gotten better over the years, but it's still there. Oh, well, you just need to get over it. You need to kind of just move on. Do you still see that out there? And what other frustrations might you have?
Unfortunately, that's something that hasn't changed significantly quite yet. You know, the stigma is real. The fact that, you know, the first order stigma is you have to admit to yourself, quote unquote, that you have a challenge, right? And then you have to actually seek out access to care. And that access is incredibly challenging in many parts of the country. You might wait weeks, if not months, to see a provider. I think we're starting to see that change, as you see in popular culture, as you see athletes, as you see kind of other people who are more honest and real about the things that they've gone through, right? And I think that's making a meaningful change. And I think we're on the early part of that journey. But, you know, the reality is there is no blood test for your depression. There's no easy way to measure stress. And for that reason, the historical, I think, clinical or medical establishment has often kept mental health to the side. You know, mental health and physical health were very separate things until, as part of the Affordable Care Act and other legislation, we've started to bring those together and ensure that there is a level of parity and coverage and support, not just for the physical health needs of an employee, but also their mental health needs.
You mentioned the Affordable Care Act. What else do you think that federal and maybe state policymakers could do to help patients deal with this major problem?
A whole lot, I'd say, Bob. The deeper I've dug into this problem, because I really, we started the company out of research we were doing at MIT as I was a grad student at the time. And the deeper we've dug, the more we've realized that there are really systemic challenges that are making this issue more pronounced, right? It certainly starts with the stigma, but there are challenges around state licensure for clinicians to ensure that when they may be available, they are available. And so the access challenges in certain parts of the country are really pronounced because we aren't able to appropriately spread, if you will, the workforce in an effective and efficient manner. I'd say part two of the problem is really around reimbursement. Historically, reimbursement for mental health has trailed much of the rest of medicine. And as a result, you exacerbate the supply and demand challenges that persist in the labor market. And so you get fewer providers who are interested in actually delivering care because they get paid less, frankly. And so I think there's an opportunity to really rethink how we reimburse for that mental health in a traditional model. But then there's more broadly, there's an incredible amount of innovation that's happened over the last decade, certainly, but especially the last few years, that is largely about virtual mental health or digital mental health offerings, right? And so solutions like Ginger and Headspace Health, as well as a number of others that are created to be more flexible, to find people where they're at that are non-traditional, but actually have been proven to work very well and have run through clinical research studies and the rest to ensure that they're delivering great care. So encouraging that sort of innovation, promoting it, figuring out ways to test it, to reimburse for it, because we think there is unfortunately no way we're going to hire ourselves out of this problem, that we're ultimately going to actually see systemic change if we bring together a combination of policy-wide changes with technological innovation to solve this crisis.
And it's a lot of it is education that with the internet, of course, you can get help and you can, there are apps that you can, Ginger, and that you can get help where, a long time ago that the technology wasn't as strong. What would you advise employers on mental health?
I'd say there are maybe three dimensions to what I think makes for a strong program that any employer can offer. I mean, the first is really leaning into acceptance, making sure that people understand, like we were talking about earlier, that the stigma is real, but that seeking out care is important. And so then making access to that care as easy as possible. So like you said, it could be as easy as opening up your smartphone or firing up a browser and talking to a coach or a therapist 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, accessing content, mindfulness and meditation resources that, again, could be available around the clock, that can be preventative in nature and actually allow you to get access before something becomes far more acute. And then the third dimension I'd say is really around affordability, is that making sure that those resources are accessible for your average employee. And the reality is that most of mental health care historically has not. It's not been accessible, it's not been available, and it's been incredibly expensive. So most people, despite the incredible demand, aren't able to get to it.
Karan Singh, I think what you're doing is fantastic. This is such an important issue, and more people are, I think, becoming educated about it, and that it is a disease, and it's not something you can just get over. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Bob. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much to Ginger co-founder Karan Singh and Bob Cusack.